Speaking directly to Joshua now. Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid, Joshua. It's going to be a tough job, but you can handle it. Let's see, what else do we have here?
At least he has some insight because he grew up then with them.
Yep, he's been able to see them all the way through. Let's see, what else do we have here? Okay. Verse 27, one of my favorite words. For I know how rebellious and stiff-necked you are. You have been rebellious against the Lord while I am still alive and with you. How much more will you rebel after I die? This is Moses talking to the Israelites. And the first time God identified the Israelites as a stiff-necked people was way back in Exodus 32. When he says, I have seen these people, the Lord said to Moses, and they are stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. So this is when God was giving the Ten Commandments to Moses, and the rest of the Israelites and Aaron were, partying down with the golden calf. God saw this and said, these are a stiff-necked people. And God and Moses used that term quite often. Verse 29, for I know that after my death you are sure to become utterly corrupt and turn from the way I've commanded you. Moses knew that the Israelites were going to rebel against God, not only because God said so in the previous verse, but he's had to intercede for them so often between since the time God freed them from Egypt till now, just over and over and over again. So the Song of Moses, and the last part of chapter 31. This whole thing is kind of like a brief history of what happened from the moment they were freed till now. This whole song. And they see chapter 31 as three different sermons of Moses. So, let's see. I'm not going to bother to pick them out now. But if you get a chance, try to break it out into three different sermons, chapter 31. So, verse 6. Is this the way you repay the Lord, you foolish and unwise people? Moses is once again predicting that they're going to rebel, and he's telling them, this isn't the way you should treat God. You've forgotten everything he's done for you, and you're just going to rebel against him. Just incredible. Just incredible. Is he not your father, your creator? Who bought you? And one of the translations says, is this not your father who bought you? Kind of like how Jesus bought us when he paid for our sins on the cross. God the Father bought the Egyptians when he redeemed them from Egypt. Let's see. He set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. So in verse 8, he's talking about how the promised land is going to be divided. Remember, it's divided by the size of the tribes. For the Lord's portion to his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. So this section just recounts the whole division of the promised land, verses 7 through 9. In verse 10, in the desert land he found you. So they're talking about Egypt, a desert land. And verses 10 through 18, this section talks about the 40-year journey in the desert where God led and fed the Israelites only to be continually rejected by them. Just think back as we were reading Exodus, how often the Israelites rebelled. They didn't have any food, so God gave them manna. And they didn't like the manna, so God gave them quail. And then they didn't have water, so God gave them water. And then at the end we find out that after 40 years, their clothes didn't wear out, their shoes didn't wear out. So continually God kept taking care of them, and they kept complaining for 40 years.
They were just rotten people.
Yeah. Verse 10, He shielded him, talking about, whenever they say him in lowercase, talking about Jacob and Israel and the Israelites, and cared for him nonstop, feeding, water, clothes, and guarded him as the apple of his eye. God told the Israelites over and over again, you are my people. I picked you out of every nation in the whole world, and I'm elevating you. And still, they didn't care. The Lord alone led him, talking about the Israelites. No foreign God was with him. Still the 40-year journey. In verse 15, we see the first appearance of this word, Jeshurun. And what that is, that's Israel. The word in Hebrew means the upright one, and the upright one, the nation that God held up amongst all other nations. So we're going to see that word 4 times. 3 times in Deuteronomy, and once in Isaiah, and that's it for the whole Bible. Why? Don't know. It's just a word that God chose to use. Okay. In verses 32:19 to 27, God tells the Israelites, here's what I'm going to do to you because of your disobedience. In verse 26, God says, I said I would scatter them and erase their name from human memory. So this goes on to tell what he's going to do to them with the nations of Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, how they would invade Israel, take the best and brightest away, and leave the poorer people and mingle them with other people from other nations that they've taken over. But I dreaded the taunt of the enemy. He was going to wipe them out, but I dreaded the taunt of the enemy. Did I skip pages? No, okay. Lest the adversary misunderstand and say, our hand has triumphed and the Lord has not done this. What God's talking about here is, he did want to wipe out the Israelites for one of the earlier sins, but Moses actually stepped in and said, you don't want to do that because the Egyptians will say that they won. That you took your people out of Egypt, but you didn't really want them. You just discarded them. And Moses said that in Exodus chapter 32:12. Moses says, why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that God brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? And God says Moses says to God, interceding for the Israelites again, turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. So that's what God is recounting in these verses here. In verse 28, he's talking about the Assyrians, the Babylons, and the Persians. They are a nation without sense. There's no discernment in them. If only they were wise and would understand this and discern what their end will be. So God's saying, if the Assyrians and the Babylons and the Persians only knew that I'm using them to punish the Israelites, maybe they wouldn't be so hard on them. But they were terrible to them. And we saw that in the earlier chapters when they were talking about the siege of the city, where the mothers and the fathers would eat their young. It would be that bad, they would be starving. So it's just some of the things that the Assyrians and Babylonians did to them. Because God would say, if they would only be able to figure this out, how could one man chase 1,000 or 2 put 10,000 to flight? Because the Israelites still were a big people, and the Assyrians and the Babylonians weren't. And yet they didn't figure out how it was so easy to take them over. Unless the rock had sold them. So in the NIV that I'm using, the rock is capitalized, so this is God saying, I am the rock. And I sold my Israelites out to these other countries. Verse 31, for their rock is not like our rock. For their rock, it's a lowercase r, is not like our rock, which is capital R. So here God is saying, the little g gods aren't like me. Crazy. And out of the three countries, Assyria and Babylon, they kind of dissolved. I think what happened is, I think the Babylonians were, the Babylonians took over the Assyrians, and then the Persians took over the Babylonians and wiped them out. The only country that still
I think
exists.
it went Assyrians first, and then Babylonians.
Yeah, so it would have been the Babylonians that wiped out the
Yeah,
Assyrians.
and then the
And
Persians.
the Persians wiped out the Babylonians. So that the only country that still exists in some form now is Persia. And that's in that handout. Where is Persia located in the world today?
Iran.
Iran, exactly.
And eventually the Greeks got Persia.
Okay. So, so that's a pretty interesting handout. Verse 36, and then after, at the right time, God is going to forgive his people again and call them back from the dispersion. In verse 36, the Lord will vindicate his people and relent concerning his servants. And in verse 37, God himself says, now where are their gods, the rock in which they took refuge in? Because at just the right time, God is going to bring his people back. Let's see, verse 43. Rejoice, you nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants. Does anybody have a version of the Bible where his people, where the H in his is capitalized? No? Okay. Because in the commentaries I saw, there's a lot of different interpretations of this. From his people being God, calling the captives to worship with God's people, Israel. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament, it's talking about angels worshiping with him. So there's really no consensus on what this verse is really talking about, that who is going to worship with God's people. So I'm just wondering if any of you guys had any of the pronouns capitalized in your versions.
You want me to look up the King James Version, Jim?
That'd be great. So verse 43. Chapter
Deuteronomy?
chapter 32, verse 43.
Got it.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Verse 44 in chapter 32. Moses came with Joshua, son of Nun, and spoke all the words of the song in the hearing of the people. It just says his name. Verse 45, when Moses finished reciting all these words to all Israel, he said to them, take to heart all the words I have solemnly declared to you this day, so that you may command your children to obey carefully all the words of this law. They are not idle words for you, they are your life. He's taking one last attempt to tell the people, you really need to pay attention to this. If you don't pay attention to this, God is going to do what he told you to. He's going to wipe you out. He's going to have you taken over by these other countries, and you're not going to be in the promised land. So Moses is continuing to intercede for these people, continuing to try to help them out. Moses to die. On that same day, the Lord said to Moses, go up to the Abram range to Mount Nebo in Moab, across from the Jericho, and view Canaan, the land I am giving to the Israelites as their own possession. There on the mountain that you have climbed, you will die and be gathered to your people, just as your brother Aaron died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people. So this is where God just tells Moses, your time is up. And in verse 51, he gives him the reason why. Because both of you broke faith with me in the presence of the Israelites at the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the desert of Zin, and because you did not uphold my holiness among the Israelites. Therefore you will only see this from a distance, you will not enter the land. And remember, this is back in Numbers chapter 20, verses 10 and 9. God told Moses and Aaron, go to the rock and just speak to the rock and water will come out. Instead, Moses took his staff, hit the stone twice, and said, here you go, you rebels. We are bringing water out of this rock for you. So it was almost like Moses was taking credit for what God did. And then,
Jim?
yeah,
Okay, not King James, not EBS, the English version, but the New King James, yes.
okay,
Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people.
his people, okay. So there he's,
Yeah.
there he's telling the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians to rejoice with God's people. Okay,
But it's in the New King James, not the King James.
huh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I thought for sure, but okay.
Huh, okay. Because usually the New King James Version follows the King James Version for capitalization. Interesting.
Nope.
Cool, okay. Where was I? Oh, yeah, so, and then in verse 12 of Numbers 20, God tells Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. So in Numbers 20, we see the reason why Moses and Aaron weren't going to go to the promised land, and God told them flat out, right there in verse 20, you're not going to go, because you didn't trust me. And then Moses blesses the tribes. So this is,
Yeah.
what?
I'm sorry, that's so sad. He did all this work, he put up with these stiff-necked people for 40 freaking years, sorry. And he doesn't get to go?
He knew the rules, hon. Now,
Yeah, but this is Old Testament God, right? Because New Testament God is
No.
the forgiving.
no. There's no difference in the God between Old Testament and New Testament. Don't go there.
Okay.
Don't go there. And this is why Jesus had to die for us.
I know.
Because if and Moses probably is in heaven anyway. He just didn't
Right.
he didn't get to the earthly promised land.
Yeah, but it's like he built the house and he didn't go to live in it.
Wah, wah, wah. You know, he just didn't follow God's law. Plain and simple.
Maybe God just didn't want Moses to witness for his people that he had worked for 40 years to get across the desert. Maybe God did not want Moses to witness this, so he would not allow him to go.
Very interesting.
That's a good point. That's possible.
Yeah.
But the reason I look at this, or the way I look at this is, it's just additional confirmation of why we need Jesus. Because we've got the 10 Commandments, which kind of proves to us we can't keep them. So we're all going to go to hell anyway if Jesus didn't die for us. So same thing with Moses. Sure, he did a lot of work. He did this, he did that, but those are good works. He didn't follow the law as it was prescribed at the time. If you were around after Jesus was born and after Jesus died, it's a different story. Because all he would have to do is repent, and then he'd be okay. Just the way it is, babe.
Okay, glad we're done with Deuteronomy.
Not yet. Not yet. 2 more chapters.
Oh, come on! We'll have an ice cream and toast at the end.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So verse 5 in chapter 33. He was king over Jeshurun. So this is telling us that God was king over Israel. Then we get to the different children of Jacob, and we go through every one of them. Let Reuben live and not die, nor his people be few. So let's see. So in verses in chapter 36, verses 6 through 25, we get the blessings given to all of Jacob's sons, with one exception.
Amen.
When you try to count them off, Simeon isn't around. So at home, check out the supplement. Why is the tribe of Simeon missing from Deuteronomy chapter 33, verses 1 through 29? And that'll tell you, and give you an idea of why Simeon is missing. Okay, so we get out with Reuben, and a lot of these blessings mirror the blessings that Jacob gave him. It doesn't say too much about Reuben because Reuben kind of fell out of favor with Jacob. And say this about Judah. Still nothing about Judah that much. Hear, Lord, the cry of Judah, bring him to his people. With his own hands he defends his cause. Oh, be his help against his foes. Judah became the northern kingdom in Israel. And they've always had a lot of problems. So they don't really get a blessing because there's not too many good things to talk about. Verse 8, we have the Levites, who are the priests. About Levi, he said, your Tumim and Urim belong to your faithful servant. Remember, those are the two rocks under the vest of the chief priest. Those were the lots that God gave them. And then in verse 9, this is where it talks about when the Levites stood alongside Moses against the rest of the Israelites in the golden calf incident. They were the only tribe to stand up, and that's when God told Moses that they are my special set aside people and they are my priests. Verse 9, he, Levi, did not recognize his brothers or acknowledge his own children, but he watched over your word and guarded your covenant. Remember, all the Levites went through the whole camp and they got rid of all the sinners. They just killed them. And it didn't matter if they were brothers or sisters or fathers or mothers. If they were a sinner, the Levites got rid of them and they were standing by God's word.
It says they slaughtered 3,000.
I think that was the 3,000 one.
Like, how many? There were a lot more than that, right? Like,
A lot more people?
yeah.
Yeah, well, because we had I think 3 million we're talking about at that time.
Yeah.
So, not a lot of the people were revolting with the golden calf, but
Yeah.
enough. In one commentary I remember from that story, it talked about that the people who were partying around the golden calf weren't even Israelites. Because remember, when they left Egypt, they were all called Hebrews, but they weren't all Israelites. And Hebrew at that time meant any poor